Okay. Something to add to that?
I do have something to add to that, David. I guess I would just comment on what Dan has said about mismanagement of the healthcare program. I think I would prefer to focus on the fact that we have really led the way in this effort. And clearly we have work to be done. I think we need to focus on the cost control issues, but I think what we really need to be proud of is the fact that we have managed to enroll far more people than we had originally intended. That means more Massachusetts citizens with healthcare coverage. I think that is clearly something we should be proud of, and something we need to continue to work on to make sure that we can do it affordably.
Okay.
Of course, we don't disagree there.
There you go. Before we get to the MBTA, one of our readers wanted to know that when Proposition 1 passes, and on the radio today where there was a ferocious debate on the air, if it passes and our state income tax is eliminated, according to VoteNoQuestion1.com, state aid for the Hopkinton schools would be reduced by 82% and town funding overall by 65%. Obviously, the readers from Hopkinton. Can you see the legislator ignoring this democratic process, bypassing the will of the people, and not enforce the referendum like they did earlier when they were told, when they were directed to reduce the same tax from 5.3 to 5.0? Now, I mentioned the radio today. Barbara Anderson, I believe. It's not Barbara.
Barbara Anderson, Citizens for Limited Taxation?
Right. She was saying that because one of the viewers, one of their listeners wanted to know, well, they did it to us before. I'm going to stay home and not vote at all because my vote's not going to count. And she countered and says, well, whoever put this initiative together did it in a very clever way because it's in a two-step way. And it's going to happen, they're going to phase it in 50% next year and then 50% the year after. I didn't know that. I learned that this afternoon. What is going to happen? Do you first see them ignoring the process? Two, if it passes, where does that leave us? Dan, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you, David. Look, I've said all along that I don't view Question 1 as part of our political reality. We've got very serious problems, very serious budget problems in this state that are going to exist on November 5th, no matter what. Question 1, unfortunately, has become a distraction from those very serious problems and is allowing the people who caused those problems to once again skirt blame because of the deluge of ad buys against Question 1. Last week, there was a poll that came out that said support for Question 1 is down to 26%. Now, if a candidate running for office at this stage were down to 26%, that candidate would be considered dead and buried, and we would not be talking about that candidate. But people have a vested interest in continuing these scare tactics about Question 1, about these horrible things that are going to happen to local services if Question 1 passes. Question 1 isn't going to pass, but lay that aside for just a moment. If it does pass, take the hypothetical, as I've said all along, it will not be implemented. And I view Question 1 as a message vote. I think voters are fed up with the way our government spends its money, fed up with the fact that last year our government took in more tax dollars than in any year in the history of the Commonwealth prior to last year, fed up with the fact that last year we had $1 billion surplus, and there was a bill that came to the floor that would have mandated that the legislature send that $1 billion surplus back to cities and towns, and that bill was voted down overwhelmingly along party lines. People are fed up. Now, I'm not the only one who considers Question 1 to be a message vote, and my opponent has criticized me quite emphatically for saying those words, but Speaker DeMacy, the most powerful individual in our legislature, the person who controls what comes to a vote, who controls what goes through, who shut down the governor's casino proposal, said this summer that Question 1 is a message vote, and that if it passes, he won't allow it to be implemented. So in my view, Question 1 is a hypothetical that unfortunately has distracted from the real issues we ought to be talking about. Local aid right now, our cities and towns, our budgets, our schools are in much greater peril from the cuts that are being forced by the irresponsible acts of our legislature at the beginning of this year that created this huge deficit and is requiring these massive cuts than they are in peril from some hypothetical that has no chance of passing or being implemented.
I don't want to shut you off, but that's a question further down in our agenda.
Okay.
What I do want to get clear, though, and what I was a little surprised, when you say that it's a vote, does that mean a what?
A message vote.
A message vote.
Yeah.
Does that mean that you would side with the legislature to step in front of the will of the people if in fact it did pass?
No, but that's, first of all, that'll happen before whoever wins this election gets there. Let me be very clear. I think it is an improper act of the legislature to insert itself into the constitutional process, and that has nothing to do with question one. It has to do with our democracy, our constitutional process. In Massachusetts, we have a mechanism in our Constitution called the citizen initiative. And when the citizens go through the work to get a measure on the ballot and then they vote for it, that becomes law. And the legislature in the constitutional framework does not have a role to step in and say we either approve or disapprove of this law. Now in 2000, when the voters overwhelmingly passed an initiative mandating that the income tax rate be rolled back to 5.0 from 5.75 where it was at the time, the legislature did what you're saying. They came into session, they said, we now hereby pass the law that says that the law you people just passed is no longer the law. To my mind, that's an extra constitutional move. They did the same thing with clean elections. We either have a constitutional mechanism in this state called the ballot initiative or we don't. If our legislature is not going to respect the will of the voters and is going to hold itself above the people, I wish the people would react to that. I think question one is in part a reaction to what they did in 2000. Obviously, it's a much more radical move, and for that reason probably has limited its prospects of passing. But utterly aside from question one, the notion of that it's even a question in our state whether the legislature would respect the will of the people is appalling to me and speaks again to the need for some change, to get some balance, to get some accountability, to get some sunlight in our government, which we don't have right now.
Okay. Carolyn.
This is an area where Dan and I have taken different positions really since the beginning when we started this race. I have been vocally opposed to question one to begin with. I don't believe in message votes. I believe that a vote is a vote and you vote based on the merits of a proposal. I don't think it's responsible for someone who is asking to be put in a leadership position to be sending message votes that could potentially result in very damaging effects to our local communities. As you mentioned, the cuts to education, the cuts to local services, the cuts to state programs will be dramatic. I also believe that this measure will not pass. At least the people that I'm speaking to in our district have are very skeptical about this and about, given the existing financial situation, whether we can, despite frustration, whether we can really take on these magnitude of cuts, 40% of the state budget. But I think the fundamental question is leadership, and where do you stand on these issues that are so important to our local communities? Again, I don't believe in a message vote. I oppose question one. If it does pass, I think it puts our state in a very difficult position. I think it puts the legislature in a position of making difficult calls at a time when we've already got some very difficult calls to make. And I found it interesting, even business leaders at this point are coming out and speaking out against question one. And I'll read a comment here from Rick Lord, who is the, let's see, I believe he's related to Associated Industries of Massachusetts. And unfortunately, I can't find his quote here, but he basically said, I believe that it would be prudent for the legislature to ignore or not enact this measure if it passed, because of the devastating effects it will have not only on local services, but also on our ability to compete economically as a state.